If I stopped anyone on the street right now, anyone, no matter whether they know anything about art or not, and asked, what are the most famous artists in the world? Two names would come up every single time: Van Gogh and Picasso. It doesn't matter the country. It doesn't matter the age. It doesn't matter if that person has ever set foot inside a museum in their entire life. Those two names are engraved somewhere in the collective memory of humanity. And then comes the question that nobody asks the right way. Why did one of them die alone, penniless, unrecognized, with barely anyone at his funeral, while the other lived surrounded by fame, fortune, and power, while still alive? Same era, same art, completely opposite destinies. That's not coincidence, and it's not luck. It's something much deeper, and that's exactly what we're going to talk about today. Vincent van Gogh was born in 1853 in a small town in the south of the Netherlands called Zundert, a town so ordinary that almost nobody would be able to point it out on a map if it weren't for the name it carries to this day. He was the son of a Protestant minister. He grew up in a simple, serious household, heavy with silence and a certain moral rigidity that marked every phase of his life. From an early age, Vincent was the kind of person who feels too much and who doesn't quite know what to do with all that feeling. Before becoming a painter, he tried other things. He was an art dealer at a gallery in The Hague, a teacher at a school in England, a preacher in a mining region of Belgium, where he slept on the floor and shared the little he had with the poor workers of the area. He wanted, in some way, to be useful to the world. He wanted to belong to something greater than himself, but nothing fit. And there's something very human in that feeling of being in the wrong place at the wrong time without quite being able to explain why. Van Gogh knew that feeling better than anyone. It wasn't until he was 27 that he picked up a paintbrush seriously for the first time. 27 years old. When most recognized artists already had a name, a trajectory, a paved path, he was just beginning, and he began with force. In the early years, he painted rural scenes, workers, peasants, dark, heavy palettes, almost without light, as if the canvas needed to feel the weight he carried inside. The most famous painting from this period is The Potato Eaters, a scene of a poor family having dinner by lamplight. No romanticism, no idealization, just the raw hardness of the lives of invisible people. But then something changed. He moved to Paris in 1886 and came into contact with the Impressionists, with Monet, with Pissarro, with Toulouse-Lautrec, and the colors exploded. Suddenly, the dark palette disappeared and gave way to electric yellows, deep blues, greens that seemed to vibrate. It was as if Paris had switched on a light inside him, except Paris was also slowly destroying him. The fast pace, the alcohol, the conflicts, the loneliness in the middle of a crowd. Van Gogh drank too much, smoked too much, slept badly, ate little, and yet he painted with an urgency that frightened the people around him. It was during this period that he went south to Arles in France. He wanted to found a kind of artists' community, a creative colony in the Mediterranean heat. He invited Paul Gauguin to live with him, and for a few months it worked, until the night of December 1888. The argument with Gauguin, the severed ear, the psychiatric hospital, the voluntary admission to Saint-Rémy-de-Provence. That's the episode everyone knows. But what almost nobody stops to think about is this. It was precisely inside that hospital that Van Gogh painted some of the most extraordinary works in the history of art. The Starry Night was painted there, from a barred window, by a man who didn't know if he would ever leave that place. Think about that for a moment. The most famous sky in the history of painting was seen through eyes that were, at that moment, trapped. There's something unbearably beautiful and tragic about that at the same time. Vincent left the hospital in 1890. He went to Auvers-sur-Oise, a small town north of Paris, under the care of Dr. Paul Gachet. And he kept painting. A painting a day, sometimes more. As if he knew time was running out, as if he needed to leave everything on record before it was too late. In July 1890, he went out to paint in a wheat field and didn't come back the same way. 2 days later, he died at 37 years old. His brother Theo, the only one who had always believed in him, who had supported him financially for years, who bought the paints and the paper, arrived in time to be by his side in his final moments. Theo died 6 months later. They say of grief, Van Gogh sold in his lifetime a single canvas, one called the Red Vineyard, sold for 400 Belgian francs. Today, his paintings are worth hundreds of millions of dollars. But he never knew that. And here lies the paradox that nobody can fully explain. How did a man who produced around 900 paintings in just 10 years of work, an absurd, almost supernatural pace, fail to sell almost anything? The answer isn't simple, and it will say a great deal about what separates Van Gogh from Picasso. But before we get there, we need to get to know the other side of this story. Pablo Diego José Francisco de Paula, Juan Nepomuceno, María de los Remedios Cipriano de la Santísima Trinidad Ruiz y Picasso. That's his full name. Already different, isn't it? Pablo Picasso was born in 1881 in Malaga, in southern Spain. The son of an art teacher named José Ruiz Blasco, a man who recognized his son's talent so early that, according to the story, he handed his own brushes to the boy while he was still a teenager as a gesture of surrender. As if to say, I've done what I could, now it's up to you. At 13 years old, Picasso painted like a seasoned adult. That's not a figure of speech, it's literal. At 13, he sat the entrance exam for the Barcelona School of Fine Arts, an exam that adult candidates were given a month to complete. Picasso finished it in a day and passed with distinction. At 15 years old, he drew a portrait of his own mother, in pencil, with a delicacy and technical precision that would make any fine arts professor stop and look twice. It wasn't the drawing of a teenager. It was the work of someone who had already mastered something that most people spend decades trying to reach, and that many never do. And this is where one of the most famous phrases attributed to him comes in. A phrase that the more you think about it, the heavier it gets. When I was 15, I could draw like Raphael, but it took me a whole lifetime to learn to draw like a child. Stop on that phrase for a moment. He wasn't being modest. Picasso was rarely modest. He was saying something much deeper. That perfect technique, absolute mastery, complete command of line. He had all that since childhood. What took a lifetime was learning to unlearn, to let go, to find within complexity a kind of simplicity that only children access naturally because they haven't yet learned to fear judgment. There's a fundamental difference here, and it matters more than it seems. Van Gogh came to art through pain, through searching, through the desperation of someone who needed a language for what he felt and couldn't find it anywhere else. Picasso came to art through excellence, through technical mastery, absorbed almost naturally, as if the brush were an extension of his own body. He didn't discover art. He was born inside it, and that shaped everything. At 19, Picasso went to Paris for the first time, and Paris, at the turn of the 19th into the 20th century, was the center of the artistic universe. Montmartre was buzzing. The Moulin Rouge still smelled of paint and scandal. Toulouse-Lautrec drank absinthe at café tables. Matisse was experimenting with colors nobody else had the courage to use. And Picasso arrived in that environment with wide open eyes and an intact ambition. He observed everything, absorbed everything, and he had a capacity that few artists possess. He knew exactly what he was doing, and he knew how to make the world pay attention to it. Shortly after the death of a close friend, a Spanish poet named Carlos Casagemas, who shot himself out of love in a Parisian cafe in 1901, Picasso plunged into a period of mourning that art history calls the Blue Period. Paintings dominated by blue and gray tones, thin figures, beggars, the blind, people on the margins. Some say it was the most human period of his entire career. But even in grief, Picasso was thinking. He knew those paintings had something. He knew they moved people in a different way. and he was slowly building a network of relationships, collectors, art dealers, poets, critics, that was paving the way for what was to come. In 1907, he painted Les Demoiselles d'Avignon, 5 female figures, angular, distorted shapes that challenged everything Western tradition had established about what a painting should be. No conventional perspective, no vanishing point. Multiple angles simultaneously, as if the human eye could see a person from all sides at once. When Picasso showed the painting to close friends, the reaction was shock. Matisse was offended. Braque said it was as if Picasso had decided to drink gasoline and spit fire. But Picasso didn't back down. He never backed down. And it was with Georges Braque that he developed Cubism, one of the most radical and influential movements in the history of art, a completely new way of seeing the world and translating that vision into image. What very few people know is that the term cubism wasn't created by Picasso. It was a criticism. The critic Louis Vaucel, upon seeing Braque's work, said they were merely little cubes, a way of diminishing, of disqualifying. Picasso took the insult and turned it into an identity. That also says a lot about him. While Van Gogh suffered from rejection and retreated further into himself, Picasso used every obstacle as fuel. Every criticism became material. Every rejection became a provocation. And over time, the world started paying attention. When the Spanish Civil War broke out and the Nazis bombed the Basque town of Guernica in 1937, killing hundreds of civilians, Picasso was in Paris. The news reached him through the newspapers, and within weeks, he produced Guernica, a massive panel in black, white, and gray that would become one of the most powerful visual documents of the 20th century. It wasn't just art, it was a stance. It was a voice. It was political presence in a world that was tearing itself apart. Van Gogh painted what he felt on the inside. Picasso painted what he saw on the outside and made the entire world see itself in it. That distinction, apparently simple, explains decades of difference in the recognition the two received. But it still doesn't explain everything, because there's a layer in this story that goes beyond talent, beyond personality, beyond artistic vision. A layer that most art history books avoid touching with much depth. And that's exactly the layer we're going to open up now. There's something nobody likes to admit very much when talking about art. That talent, on its own, has never been enough. Never. The history of art is full of geniuses who died in obscurity, men and women who painted, sculpted, drew with a skill that would bring any museum to its knees, and who were never discovered, never recognized, never had a Theo to pay the bills, or a dealer to open the right doors. Van Gogh had talent. Nobody disputes that. Picasso had it too. Nobody disputes that either. But what separated the destinies of the two wasn't the quality of what they put on the canvas. It was something that happened off the canvas, something much harder to paint, much harder to teach, the ability to exist in the world. Van Gogh was incapable of that, not for lack of intelligence. He was an extraordinarily cultured man who read Zola, Dickens, Shakespeare, who wrote letters of impressive philosophical depth. But there was something in him that prevented him from functioning within the social structures the art world required. He was too intense, too direct, too fragile in the wrong moments, and too hard in the moments that called for lightness. The people around him felt that and stepped back. Theo tried. Theo always tried. He wasn't just the brother. He was the agent, the curator, the psychologist, the bank. It was Theo who tried, without much success, to convince Parisian art dealers to look seriously at Vincent's work. The answer was always the same: beautiful, interesting, but hard to sell. Too personal, too intense. The public wasn't ready yet. And here's something that's rarely said openly. The art market at that time wasn't just buying paintings. It was buying narratives, buying personalities, buying the idea of an artist as much as the work itself. And Van Gogh as a character was too complicated to be packaged and sold with ease. Picasso understood that instinctively. He didn't just create art. He created himself as a work of art. From early on, Picasso cultivated relationships with the right people. In Paris, he frequented the cafes where intellectuals gathered. He became friends with poets like Guillaume Apollinaire, who wrote about him with an eloquence that turned each new phase of Picasso into a cultural event. When Apollinaire wrote about Picasso, he wasn't just describing a painting, he was building a myth. And Picasso let him. He collaborated. He fed it. There was also the fundamental role of Gertrude Stein, an American writer living in Paris who was one of the most influential collectors of the time. She bought Picasso's works when almost nobody knew him. She hung his paintings in the living room where she received the most important intellectuals in Paris. And she spoke about him with a conviction that worked like the highest level advertising. That wasn't an accident. Picasso knew exactly what was happening. There's a curious detail that few biographers highlight with the attention it deserves. Picasso rarely sold a painting out of impulse or immediate need. He was strategic. He held works back, created scarcity. He chose who he sold to, when he sold, and for how much. He understood that the perception of value is just as important as the actual value, and that an artist who sells everything at any price to anyone is slowly eroding his own legend. Van Gogh did the opposite without realizing it. He tried to show his work with an urgency that people read as desperation. And desperation in the art market has the opposite effect from what one might expect. Instead of generating interest, it generates distance. The buyer pulls back. The collector hesitates because art at that level isn't just beauty. It's status, it's confidence, it's the feeling of investing in something that will grow, not in something that is sinking. And then a question arises that I can't get out of my head when I think about these two men. Picasso lived to be 91 years old. Van Gogh lived only 37, 54 years of difference, an entire lifetime more. Enough time to see the world change, to see collective taste evolve, to see the art market transform completely, and to adapt to each of those transformations with the intelligence that only time allows one to develop. And Van Gogh? Van Gogh had 10 years of career, 10 years to create, to try, to knock on the right doors and the wrong ones, to build a visual language that the world wasn't yet ready to hear. Think about that carefully. Everything Van Gogh produced, the 900 paintings, the 1,100 drawings, the letters, the entire visual language that influenced generations of artists, all of it came out of a single decade. 1 decade of intense work, interrupted by hospitalizations, crises, moves from city to city, lack of money, lack of health. And the question that has no answer, but that deserves to be asked out loud, is this. If Van Gogh had lived longer, would the story have been different? If he had made it to 60, to 70, to 80, like Picasso, would he have eventually found the world that was finally ready for what he had to offer? Would recognition have come while he was still alive? Some say yes, that the expressionist movement that emerged at the beginning of the 20th century and that drew directly from Van Gogh's work would have reached him, that the artists who cited him as an influence would have created a path back to Van Gogh himself, that the market, which was slow but did arrive, would have arrived sooner if he had still been here to receive it. Some say no, that Van Gogh was, by nature, someone who existed outside of his time, and that more time wouldn't necessarily have meant more recognition, that the same intensity that made his work extraordinary also made him impossible to absorb by the market while he was alive, regardless of how much time he had. There's no right answer, but there's something unbearable about the question, because 54 years is a long time. It's enough time to see the starry night enter the history books, to see young artists around the world citing his name as a fundamental influence, to watch the price of his paintings rise, to walk into a museum and find an entire room dedicated to his work, Picasso had that time. Van Gogh did not. And sometimes the difference between being recognized in life and being recognized after death isn't talent, isn't vision, isn't strategy. It's simply time. But there's another element in this equation that goes beyond strategy, social relationships, and years lived. Van Gogh's mental health. It's impossible to talk about his trajectory without entering that territory, not as a way of reducing the man to his illness. That's a mistake many people make, and one that does a great injustice to the complexity of who he was. But as a way of understanding that there were battles happening inside him that consumed an energy that, in other circumstances, might have been directed elsewhere. The episodes of collapse became more frequent after Arles, the hospitalizations repeated, and every time he seemed to be stabilizing, something broke again. Picasso, on the other hand, had a kind of emotional armor that Van Gogh never managed to build. Not that Picasso was cold or insensitive. His works prove the opposite. But he had learned somehow to separate the inner storm from the outer functioning. The pain came in through the back door and went out through the canvas, without interfering with the lunches, the negotiations, the salon conversations. That's not a moral judgment. It's an observation. Because life often rewards not those who feel the most, but those who manage to transform what they feel into something the world can hold, buy, and hang on the wall. Van Gogh felt things in a way the world didn't yet know how to hold. Picasso felt things in a way that fit inside a frame. And here begins the most uncomfortable part of this story. Because when we understand this difference, an inevitable question appears. What would have happened if Van Gogh had lived longer? If he had had an Apollinaire by his side? A Gertrude Stein, a market a little more prepared for what he was offering? The answer, perhaps, is already on the walls of the greatest museums in the world. Because in the end, the world did come to him. It just arrived too late. When Vincent van Gogh died in July 1890, the silence was almost total. The funeral was simple, discreet. A few flowers on the coffin placed by the handful of friends who showed up. Dr. Gachet was there, some neighbors from Auvers, and Theo, the brother, standing beside the coffin with the expression of someone who already knew he was saying goodbye to something the world had not yet understood. There were no journalists, no collectors, no gallery representatives, just silence. 6 months later, Theo died, and with him the only living guardian of Vincent's work. But Theo had left something behind, a wife named Jo van Gogh Bonger, a woman that art history frequently underestimates, and who was, perhaps, the most directly responsible for the fact that you know the name Van Gogh today. Jo had in her hands hundreds of canvases, hundreds of letters, a vast, dense, powerful body of work, completely unknown to the general public. She could have sold everything at once for whatever she could get. She needed money. She had a young child to raise. The pressure was real, but Jo did something different. She studied, she organized, she cataloged every canvas, every drawing, every letter that Vincent had sent to his brother over the years. And then she began, with a patience and determination that is impressive to this day, to present Vincent's work to the world, one piece at a time, strategically building a narrative that went far beyond the paintings themselves. Because Jo understood one fundamental thing. To sell Van Gogh, you first had to tell the story of Van Gogh. And what a story it was. A man who had loved too much, suffered too much, created too much, and whom the world had completely ignored while he was alive. There was something in that narrative that struck a very deep nerve in people, a collective guilt, a tragic beauty, the unsettling feeling that humanity had failed one of its greatest talents. Jo began lending the canvases to exhibitions, first in the Netherlands, then in Germany, then in Paris. And every time people walked into a room and came face to face with those paintings, those vibrant yellows, those swirling brush strokes, that light that seemed to come from inside the canvas itself, something happened that is hard to describe precisely. People stopped. It wasn't the kind of reaction you have in front of a beautiful painting. It was something else. It was as if Van Gogh's canvases were speaking directly to some place inside the person who was looking, a place that most people didn't even know they had. In 1892, just 2 years after Van Gogh's death, the Dutch critic Jan Veth wrote about him with an intensity that signaled what was to come. In 1893, the artist and critic Emile Bernard, who had been a close friend of Vincent's, organized an exhibition in Paris that began attracting attention from the most relevant artistic circles in the city. And then came what nobody expected. Artists began talking about Van Gogh among themselves, not the critics, not the collectors, the artists, the German expressionists who were emerging at the beginning of the 20th century found in Van Gogh's canvases something that felt like permission, an authorization to feel in art, to use color as emotion, to let the brushstroke be visible, raw, honest. Ernst Ludwig Kirchner, Erich Heckel, the artists of the Die Brücke group all cited Van Gogh as a fundamental influence. When an artist begins to be cited by other artists, it is the most powerful signal that something is changing. In 1901, 11 years after Van Gogh's death, a major retrospective was held in Paris. 71 works displayed in a gallery on Rue Lafitte. And this time, Paris paid real attention. There was a young Spaniard of 20 who visited that exhibition. His name was Pablo Picasso. There are records that the exhibition affected him profoundly, that he stood for long minutes before certain canvases, that he left different from how he had entered. It's not possible to know exactly what went through Picasso's mind that day, but it's tempting to imagine that he recognized in those paintings something that was beyond technique, something that belonged to a different category of art, art as total confession. And while Van Gogh's fame was growing in artistic circles, Jo kept working. She published Vincent's letters, the letters he had sent to Theo over the years, letters that were, in themselves, works of literature. Letters where he described what he saw, what he felt, what he was trying to capture in the canvases, with a precision and beauty that left any reader stunned. The letters did something the paintings alone could not have done so quickly. They humanized Van Gogh completely. Suddenly, he was no longer just the mad painter who had cut off his own ear. He was a man who wrote about the afternoon light in the fields with a poet's delicacy. A man who loved deeply, who cared about the poor workers, who debated art and philosophy with a sharp intelligence. A man who knew at some level that he was creating something important, and who felt, with a pain that pierces the pages to this day, that the world simply wasn't seeing it. The letters sold Van Gogh as a person, and people buy from those they love. In the following decades, the trajectory was one of steady ascent. In the 1920s and 1930s, the prices of his works began to rise consistently. Museums across Europe competed for his canvases. The MoMA in New York, founded in 1929, included Van Gogh as one of the pillars of modern art that the institution wanted to preserve and celebrate. In 1987, almost 100 years after his death, Irises was sold at auction for $53 million. At the time, the highest amount ever paid for a work of art. A year later, sunflowers sold for nearly 40 million. The man who couldn't sell a canvas for 400 francs had become the most expensive artist in the world. But there's a detail in this story that few people stop to consider with the attention it deserves. Van Gogh didn't become famous despite his tragedy. He became famous, in part, because of it. The narrative of the misunderstood genius, the artist who suffered and died without recognition, created around his work a layer of meaning that goes beyond any technical or artistic analysis. When you look at the Starry Night knowing what you know about his life, knowing that sky was painted from behind barred windows by a man admitted to a psychiatric hospital, the canvas changes. It carries a different weight, and that weight is part of its value, not just monetary, a value that is almost impossible to quantify, because it belongs to the territory of human emotion, not economics. Picasso understood that. Speaking about Van Gogh at one point, he said he was the only artist who had done more for art after his death than while alive. A phrase that sounds like a compliment, but which, if you think about it, also carries an enormous sadness. Because what Picasso was saying between the lines is that the world had needed Van Gogh's death to finally look him in the eye. And now that we know how Van Gogh arrived at where he is, a different question arises. A question that may be the most important in this entire video. What does this story say about us? About how the world recognizes talent? About what needs to happen for a work to truly be seen? About the price some pay for simply being who they are before the world was willing to accept it? These questions have no easy answer, but they deserve to be asked. And that's exactly the territory we're heading into now. There's a question I've been holding on to since the beginning of this video. A question that the more you think about Van Gogh and Picasso's story, the more insistently it keeps showing up. Why does humanity have such difficulty recognizing what is extraordinary while it's still alive? That's not a rhetorical question, it's a real one. And the answer, when you start pulling at the thread, says very uncomfortable things about how human beings function. Not just in the art world, but in any field where genuine talent tries to find its place. Let's start with something that art historians know, but that is rarely said so directly. The art market, in any era, is not a thermometer for talent. It never was. It's a thermometer for collective taste. And collective taste always walks a few steps behind what is truly new. Because what is truly new is frightening, destabilizing. It asks the person who is looking to abandon a set of references they spent years building and start from zero. Few people are willing to do that voluntarily. Van Gogh was too new for the world he lived in, not in the technical sense. There were painters contemporary to him experimenting with color and form in equally bold ways. But there was something in the emotional intensity of his canvases that exceeded what people could process with comfort. It was like hearing someone shouting in a room where everyone was whispering, not because the shout was wrong, but because nobody had yet learned to listen at that volume. Picasso, on the other hand, had an almost supernatural gift for calibrating how much novelty the market could absorb at any given moment. That's not a criticism. It's the observation of a rare intelligence. He knew how to advance without losing his audience. He knew how to be radical in a way that still allowed people to feel part of the movement, as if they were discovering alongside him, not being left behind. Each new phase of Picasso was presented with the right context by the right people at the right moment. Picasso's art arrived at the world with packaging, Van Gogh's art arrived raw, without warning, without mediation. And here is something that goes beyond the story of the two of them. Think about how many times in your own life you encountered something, an idea, a person, a body of work that was genuinely extraordinary, but that you couldn't recognize in that moment, that needed time, distance, maturity to finally understand what was in front of you. That happens to everyone. Time changes perception. The problem is that Van Gogh didn't have time to wait, and that's the specific cruelty of his story. It wasn't bad luck, it wasn't incompetence. It was a tragic mismatch between what he was producing and the historical moment in which he was producing it. A mismatch of a few years, perhaps a decade or two, that cost him the recognition he deserved while alive. But there's another layer here that is even more uncomfortable. The role that madness, or what they called madness, played in building the Van Gogh myth. There is an ancient, persistent human tendency to associate genius with suffering, as if pain were a prerequisite for greatness, as if the artist who is not destroying himself isn't really creating something true. Van Gogh became the ultimate symbol of that narrative. And that has a cost that is rarely discussed. Because by romanticizing Van Gogh's suffering, by turning the severed ear into a kind of emblem of genuine art, the world created a dangerous model. A model that suggests that to be taken seriously, an artist must bleed, must fail, must be misunderstood. Picasso destroyed that model simply by existing the way he existed. He was rich, famous, celebrated, and still produced works that history recognizes as masterpieces, proving that genius and recognition in life are not mutually exclusive, that it is possible to be extraordinary and still know how to navigate the world. But the Van Gogh myth is more seductive. Why? Because Van Gogh gives us a permission that Picasso doesn't. The permission to believe that if we're not being recognized, it's because we're too good for our time. That failure is evidence of genius, that the world simply isn't ready yet for what we have to offer. It's a beautiful idea, and sometimes it's true. But most of the time, it's a story we tell ourselves so we don't have to look at the other reasons why recognition isn't coming. Van Gogh was genuinely extraordinary and genuinely misunderstood at the same time. But he was also someone who had a real difficulty existing in the world in a way that allowed the world to get close to what he was creating. And that difficulty wasn't a virtue, it was a limitation. Human, understandable, tragic, but a limitation. Picasso had limitations too, different ones, As a person, he was, in many respects, deeply flawed. His relationships with women were frequently marked by control and coldness. There was an emotional brutality in how he treated the people around him when they were no longer useful to him. Biographers have documented this with a richness of detail that doesn't fit into a simple tribute. Greatness and flaw coexisted in him in a way that defies any attempt at simplification. The same goes for Van Gogh, because Van Gogh wasn't just the victim in the story, he was also a difficult man who pushed people away with the intensity he carried, who, in some moments, sabotaged his own attempts at connection that might have changed his trajectory. Two complex men, two lives that fit no simple mold. And that's precisely why they continue to fascinate. Because when you look at Van Gogh and Picasso, without the layer of mythology that time has deposited over them, what you find are two deeply human ways of existing in the world. Two different answers to the same impossible question that every human being faces at some point. How do I stay true to who I am, to what I feel, to what I believe, to what I need to create in a world that is often not prepared to receive it? Van Gogh chose the interior. He plunged deep without concessions, without mediation, and paid the highest price. Picasso chose balance between the interior and the exterior, between what he felt and what the world could see, and reaped the recognition in life that Van Gogh never knew. Neither was wrong, neither was completely right. They were simply being who they were, in the only way they knew how. And perhaps that is what makes them immortal. Not the canvases, not the auction prices, not the museums or the history books. The raw humanity of two men who tried, each in their own way, to say something true about what it means to be alive, and who, in completely opposite ways, succeeded. If you've made it this far with me, I want to invite you to subscribe to the channel. Click the subscribe button, hit the bell, and come along, because there are still many more stories to tell. And now, back to it. There's a moment in Van Gogh's life that very few people know about, and that, for me, is perhaps the most revealing in his entire trajectory. In April 1890, a few months before he died, Van Gogh left the hospital at Saint-Rémy and went to Paris to visit Theo. It was the last time the two saw each other in person. Theo had gotten married, had a newborn son, who was baptized Vincent Willem in honor of his brother. Vincent stayed in Paris for 3 days. 3 days surrounded by people who loved him, in an apartment full of his own canvases on the walls, because Theo had hung his brother's paintings throughout the house, as if wanting to prove to the world, or at least to himself, how much he believed in that work. And Van Gogh looked at those canvases on the walls and left for over. Nobody knows exactly what he thought during those 3 days, but there's a letter written shortly after where he describes a feeling he calls a loneliness so great I could touch it with my hands. Even surrounded by love, even with his brother by his side, even seeing his own works displayed as if they belonged in a museum. Van Gogh's loneliness wasn't the absence of people, it was the absence of a mirror. He never found in life a world that reflected back what he was putting on the canvases. And without that reflection, he grew increasingly closed inside himself, in a space that was simultaneously the place where he created extraordinary things and the place that was destroying him. Picasso had mirrors everywhere. Apollinaire wrote about him. Gertrude Stein bought his works. Critics debated each new phase. The Parisian artistic world observed him, commented, reacted. And each reaction, even the negative ones, fed something in him that needed that contact to function. Picasso created in dialogue, Van Gogh created in monologue, and there's a beauty and a specific tragedy in each of those forms. Van Gogh's monologue produced works of a purity that is almost impossible to achieve when you're thinking about how the world will receive what you're doing. Because when you have no audience, when you're creating only for yourself, for the raw necessity of creating, something different happens on the canvas, an honesty that cannot be manufactured. But Picasso's dialogue produced something different, a body of work that conversed with its time, that absorbed influences, digested them, and returned to the world something that was simultaneously new and recognizable, a body of work that grew in contact with the world, not despite it. Two legitimate ways of creating, with completely different results in life, and surprisingly similar results after death. Because today, when you walk into the Van Gogh Museum in Amsterdam, an entire museum dedicated to a man who sold one canvas in his lifetime, and see the lines that form outside, the people of all ages, from all countries, standing before those paintings with an expression that mixes admiration and something resembling gratitude. You understand that time has done its work. The world finally arrived at him. And when you go to the Musée Picasso in Paris and see the monumental scale of an entire lifetime of work, more than 20,000 cataloged works, phase after phase of reinvention, a capacity for production that defies any rational attempt at comprehension. You understand that the world never stopped being with him. Two artists, two museums, two ways of reaching immortality. One cost everything in life. The other was built brick by brick, relationship by relationship, work by work, over decades of conscious presence in the world. And here is what this story, at its core, is trying to say. There is no right model for being an artist. There is no formula for recognition. There is no guarantee that talent will be seen, valued, rewarded at the right time, by the right person, in the right way. What exists is the choice of how you're going to relate to that fact. Van Gogh chose to create without concessions, without mediation, without strategy. And that choice had an enormous cost and produced a body of work that the world hasn't finished processing yet. Picasso chose to create with awareness of the world around him, without abandoning the vision, but without ignoring the context. And that choice had an immediate return and produced a body of work that shaped the 20th century in a way that very few others did. Neither chose wrong. They chose differently. And perhaps the question this story poses for each of us isn't which of the two was greater, or whose life was more just, or who deserved more than they received. Perhaps the question is something else, is which of those two ways of existing makes more sense for who you are? Because in the end, Van Gogh and Picasso are not just two artists from the past. They are two mirrors. And depending on the angle at which you position yourself before them, you see very different things about yourself. There's one last thing I want to tell you. In 1987, when Van Gogh's irises sold for $53 million at an auction in New York, there was a photograph that circulated through the next day's newspapers. The photo showed the painting being carried by two men in suits wrapped in bubble wrap, being loaded into an armored van. I think about that image sometimes. A field of purple flowers painted by a man who barely had money to buy paint, being transported in an armored van by people who never knew him, to a private collection where very few eyes will ever see it. There's something profoundly strange about that, and profoundly human, too, because that's what the world does with things it didn't know how to hold while they were alive. It builds vaults for them afterward. Van Gogh didn't need a vault. He needed a look, someone to stop in front of one of his canvases and say, This is real. I feel this too. He needed a mirror, and the world arrived late. Picasso, on the other hand, died in 1973 surrounded by canvases, sculptures, ceramics, prints, and a silence that surprised many people. Because Picasso, in his final years, had become a kind of monument while still alive, people spoke about him as if he were already history, as if the legend had swallowed the man. There are records that in his final months he painted compulsively, every day, with an urgency that strangely echoed the urgency of Van Gogh. as if, in the end, both had arrived at the same place, not the same destination, but the same truth, that creating is the only real antidote to time, that as long as there is paint and canvas and light, there is a reason to continue, that the work is not the product of the artist. It is the place where the artist truly exists, more than anywhere else in the world. Van Gogh existed in the canvases. Picasso existed in the canvases. And that is why both are still here, decades and centuries after they left this world. Not because museums preserved them, not because auctions valued them, not because history books included them, but because there is something in those works that we recognize as true. Something that speaks of an experience that is, at its core, the same for all of us, regardless of era, country, how much money we have in our pockets, or how many times we've walked into a museum. The experience of being alive and not quite knowing what to do with it. The experience of feeling something so vast it doesn't fit into words. The experience of trying in different ways, with different tools, with different degrees of success, to leave some mark on the world before we depart. Van Gogh left his. Picasso left his. And they are completely different and equally necessary because the world needs both. It needs Van Gogh's cry, that raw honesty, that refusal to be anything other than exactly what he was, even if it cost everything. And it needs Picasso's intelligence, that ability to see the world as it is, navigate its structures, and still produce something genuine within them. The world needs both, and perhaps you do too. Perhaps there's a little Van Gogh in you, that part that feels too much, that creates without thinking about an audience, that has something to say and doesn't know if anyone will be willing to listen. And perhaps there's a little Picasso, that part that observes, that calculates, that understands that existing in the world requires a certain negotiation with the world. Neither part is better. Both are necessary. The question is knowing when to listen to each one. Van Gogh and Picasso lived opposite lives. They died in different ways. They were recognized at different times, and they left bodies of work that the world is still processing, each in its own way. But in the end, in the silence that remains after the last visitor leaves the museum, after the lights go out and the canvases are left alone in the dark, what remains is the same thing. Two men who tried to say something true and succeeded. That is all any of us can do. If this video reached you in some way, if something here made sense, if something unsettled you, if something made you think in a direction you didn't expect, I want to know. Leave a comment below. It doesn't have to be long. It can be a phrase, a word, the name of which of the two you feel lives more inside you, Van Gogh or Picasso. And if there's a topic you'd like us to explore in the next video, an artist, an era, a work, a question you've been carrying for a long time, write it here too. This channel is built in that conversation. It's here that we decide together where we're going. See you next time.